Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this installment, Jason Momoa dives into action as the DC Comics superhero Aquaman. Two worlds collide when lighthouse keeper Thomas Curry, played by Tamora Morrison, discovers Atlana, a princess fleeing from Atlantis, played by Nicole Kidman. The two fall in love and have a son, Arthur, aka Aquaman, played by Jason Momoa, who among his superpowers has the ability to communicate with aquatic life. Many years later, Mera, played by Amber Heard, convinces Arthur to journey to Atlantis to reclaim his birthright and stop his half-brother Orm, played by Patrick Wilson, who plans to take control of all the underwater kingdoms as Ocean Master so he can lead a war against the surface. To stop him, Arthur must find the Trident of Atlan so he can take his place as king and bring peace to both land and sea. Aquaman arrives at a moment where the DC cinematic universe could be best described as in a state of flux. It's the first live-action film since Justice League underperformed over a year ago after a notoriously troubled shoot. It's the first post-Snyder movie. It's also the first post-Superman film because Henry Cavill has said that he's no longer returning to the cinematic universe. So many people are looking at both this and Shazam early next year as examples of where the universe may go from this point forward. Aquaman was in Justice League, of course. That was his first real major movie in this universe, aside from that little tiny cameo in Batman v Superman. And nothing against Momoa's performance, I just don't think the character was very well utilised in that movie. It didn't make great use of his powers. He was mostly just a big guy to be tackled over by the villains to make them look like a legitimate threat. So as far as first impressions go, it wasn't a very good one, and if you have that in your memory, it might be a little bit of a stumbling block, even though I did think at the time that Momoa showed enough promise that a solo outing probably would be a significant improvement, and that is very much the case. Aquaman comes to us from James Wan, who very much has a horror background. He helped kick off a number of lucrative franchises, like Saw, Insidious, and the Conjuring franchise, which has been a big money spinner for Warner Brothers, and no doubt why he got this job. Although I suspect another reason is that he directed Furious 7. That was his previous example of playing in a big blockbuster landscape, which is generally considered as being one of the best, if not the best, entries in that particular franchise, especially given the way that it handled itself after the death of Paul Walker during that film's production. So, with Wan steering the ship, I think that what this movie proves is that potentially there is still life in this cinematic universe yet. When it comes to adapting Aquaman to the screen, I think that's something of a tricky proposition, especially given the general perception of the character is that he's something of a punchline. People make jokes about how his powers are useless, they think about that Super Friends cartoon, even Brotacular Entourage basically used the existence of an Aquaman movie as a long-running joke on their show. What Zack Snyder did is that he tried to get past that by casting Jason Momoa in the role, and no one's going to make fun of Jason Momoa, not if they want to live. But the thing is, a lot of comic book fans complain that the Aquaman in the Snyder films wasn't especially close to his comic book incarnation. So what this solo film tries to do is take Aquaman from those movies and pull him closer to how he is on the page. That is essentially the journey over the course of this film. So Arthur at the beginning of this movie is essentially where we left him at the end of Justice League. Yes, he is doing superheroics, and yes, he is using his powers, but not really to his fullest ability. He's, for the lack of a better term, coasting along. That is, of course, until events conspire against him, and he's very reluctantly talked into reclaiming his birthright, essentially to make sure the world doesn't end at the hands of his half-brother. It's certainly not because he feels any kind of allegiance to Atlantis, especially because they have rejected him because of his mixed parentage. They call him the half-breed very much dismissively. He's considered himself more of a person of the land. That's really his interest rather than the people of Atlantis and the undersea kingdoms. He's not really very committed to it a lot of the time. He's very much got this kind of slacker vibe to him, and he has to be pushed into this area of responsibility. That's that word again, because of course very much what superheroes are about is about accepting responsibility. And that is what Arthur learns over the course of this film. He has to learn how to become a leader, how to become a king, how to become a full-fledged hero in his own right. And Mamoa acquits himself well here. The guy looks like a superhero. He has no problem selling that part. He's a commanding presence whenever he steps on screen, just simply because he towers over everybody else in the frame. But that's not why he works so well. The reason why he works as the character is that I actually found him to be quite charming. I found his laid-back approach and surprising sense of humour to work very well for the movie, especially because he's so tongue-in-cheek about it. I think it helps the audience swallow lots of very extreme and exaggerated concepts just simply by the sort of approach that he takes it. That sort of relaxed style very much works the film's advantage, especially because in general the movie is quite self-aware about itself in certain regards. And so that performance at the centre of the film helps it immensely, and I think it speaks to that sort of old school adventure vibe that is running through this film, but is most evident when it sort of goes a bit romancing the stone Indiana Jones in its second act, when they go a bit treasure hunting with Amber Heard's mirror. And their relationship is kind of antagonistic. There's a lot of kind of swiping banter between them, and they sell that fairly well. I wasn't really convinced of their romance though. That seemed fairly forced. I don't think there was that kind of chemistry between the two performers. It always felt a bit weird trying to push those two together when it just didn't seem like a natural fit. But in general, Mamoa is generally a big strength of this movie, but I think that also speaks to something about the film, in that I think that one of the key themes and what Arthur has to learn is that he can't simply solve all his problems with brute force alone. At the start of the movie, when he's rescuing the sub, he's using violence as a way of negotiating that situation. And he's quite brutal about it. And what he learns from that later on is that by trying to solve things with violence, what he's actually doing is perpetuating that cycle. He is creating enemies through that. That can't be the only way that he tries to negotiate peace. And so what he also has to appreciate is his ability to speak to aquatic life. I think that that power gets made fun of, but in actuality, I think there is a genuine compassion there. Whenever Arthur does speak to an underwater animal, it always is surprised by it. And I think that, in general, I think the movie tries to push for understanding and trying to resolve situations peacefully and amicably, and that leads into the way the film is ultimately resolved in the climax of the movie, which I thought was unusual for a big superhero film. But if this movie's reconfiguring Aquaman as a character, what it's also doing is reconfiguring the larger DC cinematic universe, which I don't think previously audiences have been very receptive to. They found it quite dark and oppressively grim, bordering on portentous at times. And so I think that the Snyder approach of trying to deconstruct superheroes and trying to drive these real-life parallels to tragedy just simply isn't what people want. They want high escapism, and that's exactly what Aquaman gives them. It very much leans in towards a much lighter tone than a lot of the previous entries. In terms of style and approach, it's very different to the Snyder films. Even the likes of Justice League, even though the characters did appear in that film, in terms of visual continuity and style, there's very little that they actually share between them. You remember the conversation in that film where they got the bubbles around their heads? That's not carried over into this film, very understandably so. In case you're wondering, there is actually an explanation provided for why the characters speak underwater without requiring, oxygen or bubbles or things like that. But one very much, I think, embraces this world. What I got a sense of from the Snyder films is that they were ashamed of being superhero movies to a certain extent. They didn't like being Superman movies. They didn't like being Batman movies. The character is kind of goofy and silly in regards to a lot of its concepts. So what one has done, instead of trying to take that so seriously, he instead goes, why not have fun with it? Why don't we lean into those aspects? This is a movie that very much goes wild and crazy in regards to a lot of its visual style and visual look and its concepts and ideas. This is a film where Amber Heard at one point appears wearing a dress made out of jellyfish. That's kind of bonkers, but the movie just wholeheartedly just goes for that kind of approach, and I found that very, very refreshing. When it comes to world building, this film excels itself. When you think of the sheer CGI work that went into this movie, it's almost mind-boggling to comprehend the sheer amount of workflow, because almost everything you're seeing is built in a computer later. It's all added a lot of the time. The only thing you're seeing that's real are the actors who were suspended in the air in front of green screens on wires that have been painted out later, obviously, and even their hair has been touched up in post so that it billows underwater. There's a sheer level of detail here that genuinely impresses as visual spectacle. I think the film is close to unbeatable on that front. In terms of the visual look of Atlantis in this film, I think that it's very much this futuristic high-tech world, but also deeply steeped in ancient history and tradition. And so you've got those two things going at each other, and what that reminded me of was Thor and the world of Asgard in that movie. I think in terms of the Marvel films, that is this film's closest cousin. But in terms of the visual look, you can tell they took a lot of references from movies like Tron. There's a very synthesizer-heavy score in the Atlantis sections that very much reminded me of just 80s in general. But I think that one particularly took a lot of inspiration from James Cameron's The Abyss, especially because I think there's a direct reference to it in this movie where Black Manta is sat on top of his rescue ship waiting for Orm to arrive, and eventually he does, and the ship rises out underneath him in this bright pink psychedelic light show. I think Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio describes it in that film as a dance of light. It reminded me exactly of the alien ships in that movie, and I think that's fairly interesting just simply because from what we know, Cameron is working on his Avatar sequels right now, and at least one of them is set in an underwater world, and I really do have to wonder how he's going to be able to top that here, because it seems like this movie has beat him to the punch. And the movie is just filled with ideas all the way through it. How one approaches this is that he doesn't just throw in the kitchen sink, he throws in the whole ocean. There is just endless sights to see in this film. There's one moment that really kind of blindsided me where one actually harkens back to his horror days, because Aquaman is going out trying to find the trident and he gets to what's known as the trench, and it's guarded by these piranha-like beasties, and it's a sequence that's framed like a horror movie. There are jump scares, and it's genuinely quite creepy and frightening, and it's quite nice to see one working that within the framework of a big Hollywood blockbuster. And I do think at a certain point the movie gets so enormous that it starts to lose control of itself. And on paper, the cast list looks impressive, but in practice, a lot of them look like they're simply lost among the effects work. So you have Wynn Dafoe in this film, but in actuality, he's just playing this stock mentor role. Anyone could have played this. Or you have Dolph Lundgren, who between this and Creed 2 really seems to be having a resurgence. He seems to be having a moment. Good for Dolph Lundgren. I'm cheering for Lundgren. I wish this movie used him a lot more than just being another king amongst the numerous kingdoms in this movie. The only one that stands out is Patrick Wilson, re-teamed with his Insidious director, who seems to have encouraged him to just chew on the digital scenery, which is perhaps a wise thing to do, given that he has probably some of the most unintentionally funny dialogue. Some of the dialogue in this movie is a little bit questionable, to say the least, and maybe that's why some of the performances are not especially great, but in general, it seems like they've tried to cram too much into this movie. I like the sheer scale and ambition of what they're trying to achieve on screen, but even so, this does not need to be 2.5 hours long. This does not need to be just a few minutes shorter than Batman v Superman. It does not need to be longer than your Wonder Woman movie. They should have just trimmed back certain things, especially Black Manta. Now, I don't really have any problems with the character himself. I think that he kicks off Aquaman's arc at the beginning of this movie, but really, you could have written him out. It seems like the character has been bolted onto this movie because they needed some sort of land-based foe for Aquaman to go up against. We needed a second act boss fight, essentially. And I don't know why they even needed that, because Orm sends his men after them anyway. They could have been the fight at the end of that sequence, and it really wouldn't have mattered if Black Manta wasn't there. I know they're setting this character up for further installments, that's exactly what they're trying to do, but maybe they should have just saved him for that, because honestly, the motivations for his character don't make a lot of sense. So he's making a deal with Orm, they're working together, but I don't really understand why, because it doesn't seem like he's getting particularly a lot out of it other than the access to Atlantean tech, and even then that wasn't part of the initial agreement. It feels like he adds about 30 minutes onto the movie that it simply does not need. Not helping this thing is there is genuinely things that get forgotten about, like this environmentalism thing that's established very early on in the film. There's a dramatic moment where the oceans suddenly rise up and dump back all the rubbish that's been placed in them over the years, and you think to yourself, that's fairly timely. That evokes the sense of our real life struggles with waste management and our pollution of the oceans, especially with plastic. And it's meant to be a warning to the surface of the imminent war. And it's not really the reason why they're doing it. It's actually far more convoluted than that. But it's just basically using an excuse as a pretext. But it feels like the filmmakers maybe added that in post-production to make it more topical. Like it wasn't actually there in the script, but they just wanted to evoke audiences' knowledge of this. And so that would make it a lot more understandable why it's never followed through on throughout the rest of the movie, aside from one passing line from Mera much later, and then gone from the rest of the movie. And in fact, the idea of waging war on the surface, that too seems to get lost somewhere, probably about 2/3 of the way through the film, when Orm starts trying to usurp and kill all the other leaders so that he can rule over the oceans. Like, there's so many different kingdoms, and the movie never really establishes them very well, so you're just wondering, who is he killing next? What is going on? And that all builds up to this big undersea war battle. And so what we get at the end of this movie is this huge CGI finale, which looks spectacular, and there's so much going on screen, but it gets to the point of overload. By the point this rolled around, I felt exhausted. There's just far too much going on screen. It just became visual noise. And especially because for all the busyness of the movie, when you strip away all the ballast and bombast that surrounds this 2.5-hour film, it's funny because really, you could essentially boil this down to two guys fighting over mommy issues. It seems that has still become a running motif in the DC universe. Well, you know what they say about the more things change. Aquaman isn't a great superhero movie. We already have one of those right now in the form of Into the Spider-Verse, and this doesn't really compete with that, but you know what this is? It is entertaining. I was watching this going, well, what are they going to throw on screen next? By all objective measures, this is a bit of a mess, but it's mightily fun because of it. Yes, it's overlong. Yes, it's overstuffed. But it's also filled with ideas and visual invention, and that alone, I think, makes it worth seeing on a sheer blockbuster popcorn spectacle front. It's not even the best DC Cinematic Universe movie. That still remains Wonder Woman, but what I think this represents is progress. It moves towards a much lighter tone. I think it's much more enjoyable. It is very much what it is. It's not embarrassed about being a superhero movie. So while this isn't a great film, what it does show is a lot of potential in the future for something that may well be. Aquaman is an entertaining if messy adventure in the midst of a changing DC universe. Jason Momoa makes a likeable hero, cutting an imposing figure, but also one with lots of humour and charm as he embraces his destiny, managing to anchor a film that pretty much throws everything at the screen to the point of excess. The film is indisputably overstuffed and overlong at 2.5 hours, but there is a lot of spectacle and fun to be had from just how much the film embraces its strange, unusual, and even somewhat goofy world, and that lightness of touch from director James Wan makes a well welcome change to the dark, serious tone of many of the universe's previous entries. Feeling like The Abyss by way of Flash Gordon with a bit of Indiana Jones for good measure, this is a big crowd pleaser that may be over-ambitious, but is one of the more successful DC films for simply being unashamed about what it is. If you like this review, then you can swim on over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.